Should never watch my videos before going to bed. In 1986, a young girl opens her closet to find a man wearing a dress and holding an axe. He grabs her and ties her up, and then walks around the house and does the same thing to the rest of her family. While the guy is ransacking their house, one of the kids breaks free, runs next door, and tells his neighbor. The neighbor calls the cops show up, the family's saved, but the guy is nowhere to be found. The family leaves the house and stays with relatives in hopes that they'll catch this guy before they have to go back. But after a few weeks, they haven't caught him, there aren't any leads, and they say, you know what, we'll go back to our house anyways. As the family's pulling back into their driveway, the father looks up at one of the windows and sees, for a split second, the head of the man with the dress in their bedroom. They call the police, who go in and find pennies glued to the ceiling and weird writing all over the house, but they can't find this crazy guy. Until one of the officers found a secret crawl space in the basement, where psychotic killer Danny LaPlante had been living for 2 months. Always lock your crawl space. In 2019, a young woman had just moved into the second floor of an apartment building. She noticed a tiny crawl space that connected all the apartments on the floor, but she wrote it off, citing, who'd be small enough to crawl through that? One night, she walks into her living room, and out on the fire escape is a tiny woman desperately trying to yank open her locked windows. Terrified, she hides behind some furniture until the woman eventually leaves, at which point she runs into a room, grabs her phone, and calls the police. While waiting for the cops to arrive, she hears something above her and she looks up. One of the ceiling tiles had popped up, and the woman from the fire escape is staring down at her. She'd used the crawl space to get up there. The girl screams and the woman scurries away. It took 3 days for the police to finally get the woman out of the crawl space and bring her into custody. Turns out she was on some unknown, extremely hard drug and had totally lost her mind. This is why.
Have you ever met someone who wouldn't take no for an answer? That's what happened to Jillian, but things took a strange and unexpected turn. Jillian always went to this one cafe, and one day she bumped into a young man. His name was Charles. Charles came from a wealthy family and thought that no woman could ever say no to him. He asked Jillian to have coffee with him, and she did. They had a friendly conversation for a while, but by the time the cafe was about to close, Charles gently grabbed Jillian by the hand and asked her out. She said, "I'm sorry, you're just not my type," and left. This made Charles furious. From then on, he'd come to the same cafe every single day to hope that Jillian was there. It got to the point where Jillian would look through the window and see Charles waiting for her. She'd feel uncomfortable and leave. It just seemed like he wouldn't take no for an answer. But things were not so simple. One day, it was the final straw. Charles brought flowers to the cafe and waited for Jillian. When she didn't show up, Charles took the flowers, threw them on the ground, and stomped on them. He yelled, "That's it, I'm gonna make you my girlfriend if it's the last thing I do." The next day, he looked up Jillian's address in the phone book and went to her house. But he could never have expected what he would find there. Follow for part 2. Have you ever met someone who wouldn't take no for an answer? Charles became obsessed with Jillian after she blew him off at the cafe. Charles was the type of man who couldn't accept that anyone might reject him, so he found Jillian's address from the phone book and went to her house. He knocked on the door many times until he heard Jillian's voice say, "Charles, what the heck are you doing?" Charles replied, "I don't get why you wouldn't go out with me. We had such a great conversation in the cafe." Jillian replied, "I already told you, you're just not my type. But if you really want to know what my type is, I can show you." Then she opened the door. Charles stepped in. "You see that door at the end of the hallway? Go in there and you'll see the type of man I like." Charles eagerly went in and saw a staircase leading down to the basement. What happened next would shock anyone. When he got to the bottom of the stairs, he smelled a horrible rotting smell. Then he saw that he was surrounded by 12 or 13 bodies nailed to the wall. All of them were headless. On the table against the wall, their heads were arranged in a row. Suddenly, Charles felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around and saw Jillian with an axe. Jillian swung the axe, and as Charles's head flew across the room, Jillian picked it up, looked it dead in the eye, and said, "Now you're my type."
Very scary things that happened at Disney World.
There was this man who came to the park and he was called the Balloon Cutter.
He was a man with a pair of scissors that would go up behind little girls holding Mickey Mouse balloons, and he would cut the string, releasing their balloons into the air.
And before he was caught, he ran off into the crowd. How horrible.
There was this one time where Dumbo was in a parade. It was a really hot day and he felt extremely sick in his costume.
So he threw up in his mask head and it came out all over him.
Next, we have an employee that came face to face with a panther.
Apparently, this employee was working a shift at 3 a.m. He came face to face with this panther. He backed away and luckily locked himself in a building. And lastly, the saddest one is the death of Pluto.
A 38-year-old cast member was killed at Magic Kingdom in 2004 during the Share a Dream Come True parade.
The employee who was dressed as Pluto was run over by the Beauty and the Beast parade float. It was extremely tragic, and now Disney is actually more strict about how the parade goes and their staff's safety.
Did you know that the most prolific female serial killer was cited to be one of the world's first vampires? Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian countess in the early 1600s. She favored torturing young girls so much that her husband built a torture chamber just to please her. She tortured and murdered up to 600 girls. Later on, she believed that the blood of young girls would keep her young and beautiful. It's widely accepted that she bathed in the blood of her young victims, but some people speculate that she may have also drank their blood. Her crimes were ignored for a really long time until she started targeting the daughters of nobles in the surrounding areas. In 1611, Elizabeth was tried and convicted for her crime. She was confined to a room in the castle that only had slits for air and food, where she remained until she was found dead 3 years later.
I was not ready for the ending to this one. In the early 2010s, two 15-year-old friends were camping at a state forest with their families. One night, the friends decide they want to go explore the woods around their campsite, but they want to see how far they can get without using a flashlight. A little ways into their trip, they start to hear some whispering behind them, and they quickly turn around, pull out their flashlights, and start looking for what was making the sound. After a short search, they don't find anything, and so even though they're a little bit freaked out, they decide to put their flashlights away and carry on into the woods. After a little while, they start to hear the whispering again. So they pull out their flashlights. Now they're determined to find out what the heck is making this sound. They do a very thorough search, they don't find anything, and at this point, they're too freaked out and they decide to start heading back. As they start retracing their steps, they see what was making the sound. A woman comes out from behind a tree, crawling towards them, muttering random words. She sees them, stands up, and says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking for my campsite." They're a half mile from the nearest campsite. Never go to the well on your own. In 1983, a young boy was camping with his family on Roan Mountain in North Carolina when his mom asked him to head on down the path and get some water from the well. When the boy didn't return, his mom went to check on him and he was gone. A massive search party was launched to find him, but with temperatures rapidly dropping and finding no trace of him, the family braced for the worst. Then, miraculously, on the 7th day of the search, the boy shows up on the mountaintop in an area they had already searched, healthy and clean. When they asked the boy, "Where have you been?" he said he had been at the well when a tall, faceless man showed up behind him, scooped him up, and brought him to the top of the mountain where he kept him in his cabin all week. After the boy gave a very detailed description of exactly where this cabin was on the mountain, the police were eager to go find it and confront this guy. But the park superintendent just raised his hand and said, "Guys, it's pointless. I've worked here 40 years. There are no cabins on Roan Mountain."
Elsa doll that a little girl received on Christmas of 2013. In 2013, this was a very popular gift that parents were getting their children, and it was supposed to sing the popular song Let It Go, and she also spoke certain sentences from the film. Now, at first, this family thought that everything was completely normal, but one day in 2015, this doll stopped speaking English and randomly started to speak Spanish. There wasn't a button to change the language, it just started happening randomly. And then the doll started talking even when it was turned off and even when the batteries were out. The family got so freaked out that they decided to throw the doll in the garbage outside their house. But a couple weeks after they did this, they walked in the house and found the doll sitting in a bench in their living room. The husband wrapped it up in 2 bags and put it in the bottom of the garbage can once again. Then they went on vacation, and when they got back home, they found the doll sitting in their backyard. This time they decided to mail the doll to a family friend living in Minnesota, and that friend attached the doll to a steel pipe and threw it into a lake, and it sunk.